From the studios in Joplin, Missouri, Good News Productions International presents Venture in Faith. Outstanding Christians of our own generation telling their own story of how God has worked in their lives. And now, Carl Ketcherside, Part 2.
I began preaching at the age of 12, and this happened over in Old Pearl, Illinois, which was a rural congregation. One of the things that interests me is that this little congregation was in the middle of a county where the grandfather of Lee Maynard and Joe Maynard and men like that, who are fairly prominent in brotherhood circles now, had preached the word with such effect that the only church there was in the whole area was a Church of Christ. In those days when transportation facilities were quite limited, every school district had a church regularly meeting. Nebraska Schoolhouse, Old Pearl, and places like that. Nebo, Farmers Ridge, all of those old names were places where churches met in those days. Now, I grew up in that area, and Lee Carter Maynard was one of my school teachers, the only time I ever went to a purely rural school. Prior to that time, I had gone to large schools, a two-room school, but this is one time I went to a one-room schoolhouse, the only time in my life. Well, as I told the group yesterday afternoon, I was kind of conned into preaching the word at the early age. J.C. Bunn, who was a noted evangelist for the Churches of Christ and who died only a few years ago at a very advanced age, came to hold a meeting. This was his original home. And he said at the conclusion of his meeting that a month from that time, Carl Ketcherside would deliver a sermon on Sunday night. Of course, I thought that he was mistaken. I thought that he'd had a slip of the tongue, that he referred to my father, and I went to him and told him that. But I found out that he wasn't mistaken at all. He meant me. I was a kid in high school. I was just starting high school at the time. I was about 12, and I had to walk 2.5 miles. And as I pointed out, I preached to every tree on the way in and on the way back. Now, at the age of 13, I began to leave school probably 2 weeks before school was out and return 2 weeks afterward. The teachers were very generous, and they allowed me to do this because I was completely booked for meetings. A lot of these meetings were tent meetings, and I would go into a community, billed as the boy preacher, and hold a tent meeting and baptize those who came forward during the meeting. And it was a great time because it got me safely through high school. Now, eventually, because of my father's health, it became necessary for us to move about, and we finally settled in Topeka, Kansas. In Topeka, Kansas, I diverged the only time that I ever ceased preaching for any time. I did it in Topeka, Kansas. At Topeka, Kansas, there was a great business college, and when I got out of high school, I went to this business college. And I was offered a job right away, and it was so tempting that I took it. But I still preached every Sunday. Traveled all over the state of Kansas. You could go almost anywhere by train in those days. And I traveled all over Kansas preaching the word every Sunday. I would leave on Saturday morning on the train and go down to a place like Coffeyville or somewhere like Cedarville or somewhere like Emporia and preach the word, and would come back late Sunday night or sometimes Sunday afternoon if there was no train that I could catch after having preached that night. And I continued to do this, and all the time there were people who were writing me, telling me that I had violated my covenant with God and that I ought to be back in the field and what would they do without me and all this sort of thing. And so, of course, it happened with me like it happens with every young preacher. The guilt complex that eats away at your heart and gnaws at your insides got to me, and I listened to the siren call of the brotherhood and went back to preaching the Word of God. Now, as I look back upon that time, I'm not too sure what I preached. I'm sure it wasn't very profound. I'm confident that I must have tickled the ears of a lot of people without saying too much that was very valuable to them. But I did have some most interesting experiences, and perhaps you'd like to hear about some of them. North of Topeka at that time was the Potawatomi Indian Reservation. And I went to the Potawatomi Indian Reservation once a month. And there at Horton, I banded together a small group of people. Now, a great many of these people were Indians, and they came to hear the Word of God. And I associated with them. I was in their homes, I was in their teepees, because some of them insisted on living in the old traditional style. And every year they would have a Potawatomi Indian reservation call that brought together people from the various tribes throughout the United States and even as far away as Canada. And I would go to this particular roundup that they held, and frequently I had an opportunity of speaking to some of the younger Indians about Jesus and about Christ. Now, the Indians were reservation Indians in those days. This was before Eisenhower determined that the Indians should be brought back into American life and become a part of our cultural mainstream. So it was very difficult for them on the reservation, where the older chiefs still reigned and ruled over them. It was pretty difficult to accept Jesus Christ and start a congregation. But I had a real opportunity to speak to them, and I did that. And as a result of that, I was called down to Bartlesville, Oklahoma in a tent meeting. And when I got to Bartlesville, Oklahoma, I saw something very strange. Mind you now, this was 50 years ago or better. And so as I got down to Bartlesville, I found that there were still blanket Indians. The old Indians were still insisting upon wearing their blankets upon the street, and they would come to meeting at night, and they would not come into the tent, but they would sit in a circle outside the tent. So we were completely surrounded, like Custer was, by blanket Indians. And it was a kind of an interesting thing to be able to talk to these people. Now, I found out that there was quite a bit of prejudice on the part of the white people who composed the congregation to the Indian people in so far as association was concerned. So I got my first taste of racial prejudice in the church, and through God's grace I overcame it. I would go to the home of the Indian people and would eat with them. One of their favorite delicacies was dog. Any dog that wandered around in that day was a goner. He would be in a stew pot by noon that same day. Now, I'm not sure that I ever ate any dog, but I'm not sure that I didn't eat dog either. I did eat snake. That was a delicacy among them. So I found it was possible for me to amalgamate with the Indian people and move into their lifestyle and not demand that they move into mine. And I think that was good training coming that young in life. I am sure that it was real training for me in the future. Now, one of the hazards of being a young preacher, 16, 15, 16, 17, is the girl problem. And the problem was not so much girls as it was their mothers. Everywhere you would go, there would be some conflict between the mothers in the congregation who wanted to foist their daughters upon you. Well, fortunately, I could relate to girls, I guess, in a fair way, because when I was in the third grade, I remember that I loved every girl in the third grade, and there wasn't a girl there that looked ugly to me. Every girl in the third grade was a beautiful girl. Just the fact she was a girl made her beautiful to me. And I used to sit around and dream about, maybe I could become a Muslim and marry more than one. Maybe I could have 4 or 5 of them as I grew older. And on Valentine's Day, which was a pretty big day in the little school where we went, the girls could always be assured of getting one Valentine. Now, we were so poor it was impossible for us to afford Valentines that were purchased at the store. They cost a penny each, and it was very difficult to purchase 10 of them. And there were about 15 girls in the class, so the evening before Valentine's Day, I would always take home the old pencil tablet, and I would tear out the sheet and fold it in such a way that you could cut a heart that opened up. And inside the heart, I wrote those tender, compassionate words. Every girl in the class got a Valentine that said exactly the same thing. If you love me like I love you, no knife can cut our love in two. And dropped it in the Valentine box, so they were passed out the next day. So the girl problem wasn't too great a problem for me because I loved them all without loving any one of them too much. And that's a great art, I want you to know. And it becomes a special secret that I'm not willing to divulge. But as I would go about from place to place at the age of 16, the women would always come up and say, I want you to meet my daughter. And she's a very fervent Christian. Well, she wasn't as fervent as her mother hoped she would be, and expected to use me to increase her fervency. But still at the same time, that was one of the hazards that I look back upon, and I'm thankful to God that I passed safely through that. Incidentally, I was married at the age of 20, and I think I was half married before I ever met Nell. I had heard so much about her from other preachers, and I had learned so much about her beauty and this sort of thing that I think I was already just about under before I saw her. But when I saw her, she was going with another boy, and I realized that I had a rival, and I had to eliminate him. It wasn't very difficult to do that because he was not a Christian, and of course I was the front man for the Church of Christ, and fortunately where she lived, the people could not get in the house. The crowds were so great at night that they had to raise the windows and let people stand outside, and they were standing on the front porch, and it was just great, you know, to be able to speak to a tremendous crowd that completely crowded out the house. Well, I asked her if she would like to ride up with me to the place where I was staying, which was 6 miles from there. And she and her sister and brother-in-law, now, they were not married at the time, took me up there. And that night I promised her that I would write to her. And I really fell completely off the roof, you know, and squashed when I hit with reference to this girl. I wrote her every day for 365 days. And not only did I write her every day, sometimes I wrote her twice a day. And then I got the idea of publishing a little magazine dedicated to her called The Nail. So I published that magazine once a month and did all the cartooning and all the artwork and all this sort of thing in it by hand. Now, I didn't realize what women did with things like that. I thought, you know, they would read them and throw them away. But after we were married, and I married at the tender age of 20, I had to mark 21 on my shoe soles so that I could tell the girl I was over 21 when I got the license, because my parents lived in Topeka and I got married down in South Missouri. But after we got married, and we had been married for quite some time, I was rummaging through some things one day in the cedar chest, and there were all those letters and all those things with all of my protestations of love and all my fervent outpourings. And I can say this, that I waxed more eloquent in talking to her than I ever did to any audience. I was really a William Jennings Bryan when it came to talking to Nell. Now, the strange thing about it is that we've been married 53 years, and I feel more deeply involved with her now than I did when we were first married. I didn't think that it's possible to learn to love a woman like I have come to love her and respect her. And I don't mind telling you that it's great to be able to go out and to talk and share with other folk, but it's even more wonderful to go back home and to know that she'll be at the airport to pick me up. So I just want you to know that we've had a very, very glorious time. Now, it wasn't too long until our children came. We have two, Jerry and Sharon Sue. And we began right away with these children to rear them in the faith, and I have already pointed out to one group of people who asked me a question if there was anything that I would do over, if there was anything I would do differently if I had it to do over. And I pointed out to them that one of the things that I would do over if I had it was my treatment of the children. I'm sure that I imposed upon them a great deal. At the time when they were very small, I was holding 4 meetings every week, 4 meetings a night every week, besides being involved every Lord's Day at length. And so I insisted that these kids go with me. I think I did that because of my own ego. I think I wanted people to say, well, that preacher certainly has his family under control. That's a lovely bunch of children, you know, and they're all so obedient and that sort of thing. Now, I wouldn't do that. If my children were small now, I would let them stay home at night and get their algebra and get their English and work on their material. I would never, in order to enforce my lifestyle, I would never crimp theirs. And I think that they would be better. I think that they would be better for that. But fortunately, through God's good grace, it has turned out to be really great. In 1929, I was married in 1928 in June, and in September of 1929, our son was born, Jerry. Obviously, before he was born, you know, I felt his pulsation in Nell's abdomen, and I was looking forward with a great deal of thrill and a lot of joy to having him. But I never experienced in all this life quite the thrill of exultation that I felt when this son was born to me. And I realized that a part of myself and a part of the girl that I loved was now involved in a third personage. Our children were both born at home. There was no hospital, and doctors were so far that if you got sick, there was no use of going after one because you'd either be dead or up squirrel hunting by the time he got there anyhow. So we had arranged with an elderly doctor who was just getting ready for retirement to come, and he came, and I learned things about childbirth that night. I said to the doctor, you know, I was as nervous as I could be. Somebody said as nervous as a mother kangaroo with her child in her pocket, and the child had the itch. So I was really nervous, you know, and I said to the doctor when he came in, I said, is there anything I can do? And he said, yes, there is. I'm glad you're here. And he said, would you go out and fix a lot of hot water, get a lot of hot water for me? I'll need a great deal of hot water. So I bustled out to the kitchen and started putting on 2 tea kettles. We lived in a very humble home at the time, and I put on these 2 tea kettles and turned up the fire and got a lot of hot water and stayed there to watch it. Well, it came to me afterwards that he had never used that hot water, never asked for it at all. So I said to him, now, you asked me to go out and fix hot water, and you never use it. He said, that's our means of getting rid of the husband. So I learned a lot about childbirth at that time. Well, it was just a little over 2 years later that our daughter Sue was born. And I want to tell you that I guess probably it's a little wrong to come and brag about your kids because you wouldn't know them, you wouldn't know their failings, but we have been particularly proud of them. In the first place, Jerry is now an elder of Dunn Road congregation in St. Louis, and he has been employed on the space capsule program. He is a head of a department for McDonnell Aircraft. And Jerry and Emily, who was a little girl from Arkansas, got married, and originally the only thing they knew to fix. Jerry knew how to make French toast, and Emily knew how to make spaghetti. So for months on end, they lived on French toast and spaghetti. But it was always easy for them to come over to the house and eat some of Nell's cooking. But I want to say to you that they had 2 sons. So our son had 2 grandsons. And at the time when these grandsons were born, there arose among the people, most of whom were Jewish scientists and Jewish electronics experts, there arose a kind of a desire to bring back to St. Louis a part of the heritage from Denmark and Norway and Sweden. So they began to name their children, you know, all kinds of Swedish names, and you'll find Jewish families in St. Louis today with kids that are born that are you know, look like they're born right in Sweden or Norway, running around with names of various kinds. So Jerry was caught up in this thing, and he named our first grandson Griffin, Gryfon, and his second one Eric, Erik. Now these were utterly strange names to our world. Well, the kids have become successful in their own rights. Now all 4 of them, I'll tell you about the other 2 in just a minute, all 4 of them have graduated from universities with master's and with doctorate degrees. And Griffin is presently working as a cartoonist for McDonnell Aircraft. And he is doing cartoons now that are being caught up on visual tape that are sent to Saudi Arabia and to places of that kind so that the mechanics over there can repair the planes by looking at the cartoons. And Eric is following the non-instrumental tradition. He's a marching band leader for a high school. That seems a little strange, you know. Sue married Kurt Burton, and they live in Denver. And Curtis at this time is he has to do with public relations. He is the public relations man for Arco Oil Company and is involved in the work in Alaska. And I don't know what public relations you'd have up there unless it would be to go up and interview the moose and the water buffalo and various things like that that'll be crossing the line. But he spends his time in Alaska and in various places throughout the United States, is flying pretty continuously as their public relations man. And Sue is the director for a plastic surgery clinic. She is the mother hen for 3 surgeons, 2 of whom are divorced and find themselves quite lonely and this sort of thing. And she has to take over the work of interviewing older people who come into the place because these men are pretty grumpy with them. You know, when you're lonely and discouraged and frustrated, you find yourself unable to relate to people. So she is their mother hen. And she has 2 daughters, one of whom is our oldest granddaughter and our oldest grandchild. That happens to be Dawn, and Dawn married a young lawyer who had just finished the University of Chicago. And Dawn has just finished her doctorate degree at Northwestern University, and her major is in audiology. So she'll be working with deaf children now and determining the degree of their hearing. Andrea became a linguist and spent a great deal of time in South America, in Nicaragua and in Peru and in Chile. And she is now working for a large banking corporation that has interests in South America, and she takes care of their South American interests. That pretty well runs down the family for you. Nell and I are left alone now. But we have no feeling of loneliness. And I think that loneliness is a kind of an attitude. I don't think that there's any need of people as they grow old feeling lonely. I've always worked with young people on the university campus and wherever. I've always been associated with them. And in the next segment of this particular film, I'll be talking a lot about that. But Nell and I live lives that are relatively modest and quiet. When Sue got married, she was our last. We had a meeting of the minds, and the 2 of us sat down, and Nell was crying. She said, "Well, that's the last one. She said, we don't have anything left." And I said, "You have left all you had to start with. That's me." So that didn't particularly placate her. But in any event, we realized that our life was going to be different. So we began to talk about it, and we resolved that we would live the simple life, that we would not purchase anything that was not necessary. We would buy a car not because of the amount of chrome or the size of the engine, but we would buy it purely because of its functional usage. We would buy it for transportation and only for that. And so we have found that we are able to live very modestly and within our means, and we're quite happy. I think it will interest you that from the very beginning, I made a firm resolution to God that I would never enter into a contract with any congregation or any group. And not only would I not enter into a contract with them, but I would also never make any kind of arrangement about what I was to receive where I went before I arrived. So always I've operated purely on the matter of faith. I just go wherever I feel like the Holy Spirit opens up a door for me, and I tell the brethren that I'll come and work with you as long as you want, and if you give me enough to go home on, I'll go, and if not, I'll stay with you till you do. And never have I failed to get enough to go home on at the end of 3 days. It's been no problem at all, because 3 days pretty well takes care of the situation. Now, I'm not saying that this is the way for people to go. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with making a contract. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with having an agreement before you go as to what you'll receive. But I do say that it's not for me, and it's not for Nell. And fortunately, I married a woman who was willing to do without certain things. And so today we have a kind of an agreement among ourselves that we will pay cash for what we get, and if we cannot pay cash, we'll wait until we get the cash and do without it until that time. Now this way, we eliminate two things. First of all, we eliminate the worry about debts that are coming due, and secondly, we eliminate the problem of putting other people's children through college by paying interest for our money. So we feel very content and very happy, and as we wait for death, really I don't think we're waiting for it yet, but as we approach the time when we realize that death is going to come, it doesn't hold any horror or terrors. I think a lot about it at night when I wake up. You know, I think, well, suppose I'm somewhere in Alabama and my heart quits beating at night, you know, in a motel, and they find me there the next day. How will I feel? I can't think of any place that I'd rather not die than Alabama, but I'm a little bit like W.C. Fields, who always insisted that he'd rather be dead than in Philadelphia. But in any event, I think a lot about death, and I try to prepare myself for it. And Nell and I talk quite a bit about it, and we try to prepare each other for it. Last year came the real test. We had never been in the hospital. I had never been in the hospital since my honeymoon. On my honeymoon, I went to the hospital. It had not one thing to do with her cooking. It was the result of a honeymoon that we were taking, in which I was going to California to hold 2 meetings while we were there and combine business with pleasure. And we got way out in just on the border of Wyoming, and I came down with a sudden attack of appendicitis. I didn't know what it was, so I went to a doctor, and fortunately, in the town where we were in Nebraska, this little cow town, in that day, I found a doctor who had retired from his work as a surgeon in Omaha and had come out there. He looked at me and told me, I'm going to have to pack you an ice and see if I can get you ready to go back home again. Home was Topeka, Kansas for me. I'll see if I can do that. Well, a week went by, and Nell and myself on our honeymoon were there in that room in that hotel, and she had to keep me packed in ice day and night. So she kept me packed in ice, and early Saturday morning, the doctor said to me, now, you get up and go out to the restaurant and order anything you want. Well, I ordered a great big breakfast because I hadn't eaten anything for a solid week, which is a wonderful way to spend a honeymoon anyway. But in any event, I went out and ordered this big breakfast, and I saw it, and I became deathly ill, and I went back, staggered back to my room in this little flea-bitten hotel, and went to bed again, and the doctor came that afternoon and said, I'm going to have to operate on you. So that meant 2 weeks more. And that the hospital was a kind of a ramshackle affair. A nurse had come out there, and she had bought a home and had 2 rooms above and 3 below, and she had turned the 2 above into an operating room and a hospital. So they took me up there and put me under and took out my appendix and this sort of thing, and I had to stay there. Now, the funny thing about this is that the man who operated on me was an atheist. And he wasn't just an atheist, he was a blatant atheist. He wanted to talk about atheism. So he said to me that after he had operated on me, he said, we were on a first-name basis at that time. He was Frank, Dr. Frank Shambaugh. I was Carl Ketcherside. And so he said, Carl, you know, I hate to see a man of your caliber and a man of your youth and a man of your potential, I hate to see you get flim-flammed into believing a bunch of this claptrap about religion. He said, now, I cut you wide open like a watermelon, and I looked inside of you, and he said, I didn't see any spirit in there at all. And he said, how do you know that you've got a spirit, and how do you know that God exists and this sort of thing? Well, of course, I was kind of woozy at the time and not thinking too straight, but I looked at him and said, Now, as I look at you, I can't see your brain. Shall I conclude that you don't have one, or that you're just operating brainless? And I said, you didn't find a spirit in me, and I don't know, have you ever seen your mind? Have you ever seen it operate? And he said, no, of course I haven't. And I said, well, how do you know you got one then? So we argued back and forth, crisscrossing back and forth like that the entire time I was there. It was a great privilege to be able to talk to this man who I think was running from something, fleeing from something, and who desperately needed the Christ that I had learned and that I had found. That's probably enough about our personal life. Now let me go back and talk with you just a few minutes about some of the things that happened in my religious life. I soon became an avid reader. I already was an avid reader, I guess, before I became a Christian, even though I obeyed the gospel before I was 12 years of age. But I became an avid reader, and I read everything. I learned the little smattering of Greek that I have over an oilcloth table with a coal oil lamp, bending over the books at night and reading them. For 7 years, I read a book a day, and I never would go to bed without finishing that book at night. In the farmhouse where we lived, it was very cold in the wintertime, and we had a great big stove in the living room, and I would get down by that stove and huddle as close to it as I could. The folks would all go to bed, and everybody went to bed early in those days, 8:30, and I would still stay there and read and read and read. And by that time, we had secured an Aladdin lamp, and I thought that Aladdin lamp was the greatest blessing that the United States had ever devised and developed, because it made so much more light to read by. But eventually, I would get the lamp down and set it on the floor, and I would scoot back under the stove to maintain whatever warmth there was in it as I finished a book. And I did this year after year after year. Now, fortunately, I had a fairly retentive mind, but I soon found myself gravitating toward two types of literature. One was history. I am a bug for history. As a matter of fact, I still order 8 or 10 large books of history every month. And I go through these, wade through them, and I do it with the same degree of avidity that the average person reads the footnotes in the Reader's Digest, the little jokes at the bottom of it. I don't think anybody reads the Reader's Digest, but everybody wants to read the jokes in it. And that's the way I read history. And then biography. And I have been triggered off to read biography by the places where I have been. I came back from England, and I wanted to read the life of William Pitt the Younger and William Pitt Sr. These were people who were alive at the time when the American Revolution began. And I wanted to understand the American Revolution from the British standpoint. So I read these stories. And then I read a book that came out 2 years after the American Revolution had begun. And it was an interesting book that I read, a book of history that had to do with the English and American people. And during this time, I formed some conclusions about what has happened to us. And I don't mind pointing out to you that the Restoration movement probably was oriented toward American culture because of the fact that the people who settled America were primarily Scotch and English. And the people who began our Restoration movement were Scotch and Irish. So this made it possible for them to really move into our culture. And they could speak to us because of their love for the old world and the old country. And I found that things were changing a lot when the American Revolution was just one of a series of revolutions that were beginning. It was a time of ferment, much like now. Shortly after our revolution was over, the French Revolution began. And then, as a result of the French Revolution, there were great changes that were made in American culture. And Thomas Campbell refers to the French Revolution in his Declaration and Address as having a particular impact upon what was done. So you see that nothing that has happened to us has happened outside the realm of history. And I have wanted so desperately to know history. And I'm right now reading 4 volumes, huge volumes of history, Mosheim's history of the early church. And it is a great source of material for me. Now, I don't think everybody likes to read history like that, but reading history has triggered me off. As I have traveled about throughout the world, I have found places that I have read about in history and longed to see. And another thing that's happened is that as I hear about these men, I have wanted to pick up where they began. I remember being in Harper's Ferry and reading about the mistake that was made by John Brown of Osawatomie. Well, I came home and read 2 books about John Brown of Osawatomie. And as I read these, I learned that he had stopped on his way over to Harper's Ferry and stayed all night with Alexander Campbell. Alexander Campbell had an idea about getting rid of slavery that if it had been bought by the Congress would have probably saved us the Civil War. But he couldn't convince John Brown, who was a real zealot for his work and who went over to Harper's Ferry. Well, we went down to Monticello, and we became convinced that of all the great inventors that we have ever turned out, probably Thomas Jefferson was first, and next to him was Benjamin Franklin. So I came home and read 2 books about Thomas Jefferson, 2 large books about him, because I wanted to know more about him and fit into his life. And so I've read all of these books, and I find myself being able to use them as means of a means of gathering material that can be used in sermons and this sort of thing. And so I have gotten a reputation as being a historian, when really I'm not at all. It's just borrowed, it's secondhand material that I've been able to pick up and use as I've gone along. But I would like to make a suggestion to you that whatever your field is, whatever you intend to prepare for, that you never stop reading. Don't stop reading. When you get to be 73, going on 74 like I am now, and you realize that you've got a lot less time left to read, you'll want to redouble your reading, and you'll want to zero in on things. But please do not just read books of history, because there's a lot of contemporary things that are happening in our day, and a great many beautiful, wonderful books being written. I think it's rather interesting that these books are being written by people outside of our movement. I think it's great that they're being written by Anglicans especially. I glory in the fact that John R.W. Stott and J.I. Packer and Michael Green are writing such tremendous things for our generation and our day. Now, this is indicative of the fact they've caught a vision of the unity of God's people. And I think it's beautiful that we have such works as J.B. Phillips, Making Men Whole, and C.S. Lewis. What a real gift he was to God's people. And if you have not read his Surprised by Joy, which tells how he found Jesus Christ, please read that book, because it will show you what happens when a man is an agnostic and a virtual atheist. In the last chapter of that book, he said that he became convinced that there were thousands of people in the world who accepted Jesus Christ willingly, but the day that he came into the kingdom, he was dragged kicking and screaming and digging his heels in the carpet, resisting every inch of the road. And yet he came to Christ, and what beautiful things he wrote. He was God's answer to our modern world. Now, it has been a fascinating life between the time that I began at the age of 12 and the time that I was changed, that I found a tremendous impact made upon my life by, I'm convinced, by an experience with Jesus Christ. I'm not a charismatic, and as I said yesterday in chapel, I didn't have any kind of a feeling running over my body and dribbling out of my toes, starting in at my head, and a hot feeling or anything like that. I didn't have hot flashes. But in any event, this was a tremendous thing that happened in North Ireland. And I remember talking to James D. Forrest Murch, who was a very good, a very dear, and a very close friend of mine after we got to visiting on campuses. Brother Murch would get up and speak. He had a voluminous amount of data that he could use. He would put them to sleep, and then I would have to get up and try to wake them up. But in any event, he came to our home many times. We had great talks together. And he told me about what happened to him one night and how God apparently gave him in his sleep a kind of a vision, and how he was true to that vision, and how he arose and sparked a movement that had a great effect upon the Christian churches. He also was a great worker for unity. And so, as we bring this little saga to a close, please remember that every life here is important. You're important to God. Never derogate your abilities and your talents. I do not even know what the word depression means. It's not in my vocabulary. I've erased it from my dictionary. I don't even know what it means, because I constantly, day by day, walk with Him, letting Him direct my steps, and I hope that you'll be able to do the same, and one of these days we'll be able to meet, if not here again, on a better shore. I'm getting ready for it, and I hope you are too. Thank you a lot. God bless you.